unexpected from the Yale team. Thanks for coming. Relevant, they work with you, so. So I'll just start with an acknowledgement. So my name is Priscilla. I'm with IFYS Domestic and Family Violence Coordination Service. This is news to you, Gabby. I'm a white Australian, and my family have lived on Aboriginal land for 7 generations. I grew up on Gabal country, and I'm raising my family on Gubbi Gubbi country here in Coolum. We're meeting on land that always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I acknowledge that the traditional custodians of this land are the Gubbi Gubbi people, Yinabara people, and Ndambi people. Country is loved, country is needed and cared for, and country loves, needs, and cares for her people in return. Country is family, culture, identity. Country is self. I pay tribute to the enduring strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and cultures, and I acknowledge that all Australians benefit from the generosity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people sharing their country, their culture, and the ways in which their generosity has shaped our knowledge of country and our identity. I acknowledge the adult and children victims who have died as a result of domestic and family violence, and those who show great resilience and strength despite continuing to experience and live with the impacts of domestic violence. As I welcome you to our networking event today, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to each of you for your commitment to our community in working collaboratively towards a community free from prejudice, discrimination, and racism, and progressing the collective knowledge of our community towards really understanding, valuing, and actively supporting the inclusion of First Nations people in all aspects of our work. Thank you for your ongoing commitment to changing the dialogue from destructive and victim deficit language to recognising the strength and value of the victim if only we really listen and believe them, and committing to shifting our focus and recognising that is the perpetrator that we must always consistently and systematically be holding to account. As I hand over to Professor Silke, I'd like to say a really big thank you to you for both your knowledge, passion, and time invested in leading new research and practice in this field. Thank you. Thank you. The arrows to change the screen.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for having me. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and also to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, and also acknowledge that this land always has been, always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm from Griffith University. I've done a fair bit of domestic and family violence related research over the last 15 years. I've got a practitioner background in social work, predominantly in intensive family support services and victim support services. And today I'm going to be talking about adolescent family violence, adolescent violence in the home. I'd like to ideally make this as interactive as possible. So if you've got questions or comments throughout, feel free to just interrupt me, ask away, and we can have a conversation throughout. Otherwise, we can have a conversation afterwards, because if you have had a chance to look at the ANROS report, which I'll be talking predominantly about, it is very stats heavy. And I'll talk a little bit about what it is, but the first report is based on Australia's first national survey of 5,021 young people and their use and or experiences of violence in the home. So a lot of it is quantitative results with some qualitative feedback on how young people make sense of their experiences of experiences and use of violence in the home. The second report that's coming out in October will be a much more qualitative narrative of the other component of the study, where young people talked about their disclosures of experiences of domestic and family violence as well as use of violence. their help seeking, their support needs, and I guess where they felt heard as opposed to where they felt let down when they started to reach out for support around their experiences. I also want to acknowledge that this is teamwork. So I was, well, I guess, first of all, we were very lucky to get ANRO's funding in the 2021 ANRO's funding round that focused on children as victim survivors of domestic and family violence. Also want to acknowledge the 5,000 plus young people that actually took the time to, that took the time to complete our survey, and quite a lot of them provided fairly detailed qualitative responses. So really reflecting that a lot of these young people wanted to have a voice in relation to their own use of violence in the home, but also their experiences of violence in the home and how that's impacted them growing up and their development and well-being. I did the study together with Monash colleagues, so Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, Professor Jane Reamer, and Professor Stephen Roberts, and also Hayley Boxall from the Australian Institute of Criminology, who essentially is the stats brain on this project because the rest of us are all qualitative researchers. So I'll talk a little bit about the background and then the study in particular, and then some of the implications, and again, particularly around the implications, depending on what service area you work in, if you've got comments, if you've got questions, if you want to have a chat afterwards, what that might mean for some of the family experiences that you see in your practice, then feel free to, again, either ask as we go along or come and have a chat afterwards. So what do we know about adolescent family violence or adolescent violence in the home or adolescent to parent violence? And I guess kind of how we understand it or how you look at it, I suspect depends a little bit on what kind of practice area you work in terms of, you know, whether it's from a policing or court perspective. Like, I think we've seen some recognition of adolescent use of violence in the home, partly in the broader context of domestic and family violence, probably for the last 10, 15 years in research, primarily coming from overseas, primarily coming out of the UK. Probably more of a growing concern. Like, I noticed I was in Victoria the last 3 years up until the beginning of this year, that after the Royal Commission into Family Violence, it certainly became a more recognised issue in the service sector. Police raised concerns that they were increasingly seeing young people being subject to police call-outs to family homes, courts or magistrates noting that they're increasingly seeing police referrals or police applications for young people being subject as a respondent on a domestic violence or in the Victorian context on the family violence intervention order, child and youth mental health services. And I guess overall a big question mark of what do we do? I guess there was some focus initially around it. We're dealing with perpetrators. What does this mean? But they're children. Is this similar to adult perpetrated domestic and family violence or predominantly intimate partner violence, I guess. So I think it raised a lot of concerns, but it also raised more questions than answers, despite all the knowledge we've built across the sector around adult domestic and family violence over the last few decades. So we've certainly seen a bit of Australian research come out and raising the issue of partly what kind of responses do we need between the law as opposed to more trauma-informed responses, accountability frameworks, and I think a lot of that has come out of what we've seen the last probably 5 years in Australian states and territories more broadly, ever since we've moved perpetrators onto the agenda. There's a lot of focus on perpetration, accountability, and punishment, and secondary, maybe some trauma-informed practice, which I think seems to stand out, certainly in the Victorian context where we've done consultations, seems to stand out to practitioners that when you're dealing with young offenders, the trauma-informed lens becomes even more critical in terms of recognising underlying trauma and trauma recovery needs and the role of trauma and use of violence then it may already be recognized in some of the adult men's behavior change space, for example. I think, and I mean, maybe unless anybody wants to comment now, I'd be keen to hear where you're coming from when you see this in your practice. And whether you're working in a space where you may primarily see this come up because it is son to mother perpetrated adolescent to parent violence, where it then often takes a more gender framework or more gender nature, as opposed to if you see this in the child protection or child and family welfare space, where there may be more of it may be more obvious that there's underlying childhood trauma. Is there anybody here who would like to share from your practice what you see, or whether you work in a space where you primarily come across this because you have mothers as clients and it is predominantly adolescent male to female perpetrated, or more from a child-centered perspective? And if nobody wants to say anything, then we can have a chat afterwards.
In my
In
my experience involving mothers who happen to be declining and sons, usually teenage sons who were named as perpetrators. But like I said, it's usually huge trauma issues underlying the violence as well. So yeah, but it's usually son and mother, which is always a very complex relationship in itself to begin with. And you add violence, and then it's just another.
And I think partly what we've seen in the Victorian context, where there's more resourcing that has come out of the Royal Commission into Family Violence or adolescent family violence specific services, is that the son to mother violence seems to be what often becomes more visible, either because it's more severe, it tends to escalate. Police are often the last resort, but then once it comes to police intervention, it also becomes it comes to the attention of court intervention or other service providers. So there seems to be this visible proportion of that gendered kind of pattern that we also see to some extent in the adult space. And then there seems to be a lot of that underneath that may become obvious in the child welfare space, statutory or non-statutory, but doesn't necessarily make it to that escalated level where mental health services police or what's coming for. So I find that quite interesting, because you kind of depending on what sector or space you sit in, you have a very different perspective on, whether this requires a feminist framework intervention or a trauma-informed intervention, or, whatever may sit behind it.
Yeah, Silke, I was going to say, certainly in the child safety space, we're seeing it. I think it's, certainly in reflects on my own practice, it's hidden because we're not screening for it. So if we go in and there's even case old age, in regards to the father figure, and we've got a teenager, we might have a teenager or etc. children, and we don't even get to that space. Yeah. And so I think a lot of it's hidden. I think there's a lot more than we're even finding out. I think we've always, like Deb was just saying, then where do they go? That's another issue for us. It's almost like, which is sort of a weird, it's almost like with adult perpetrators, right? It's like, well, we've only got so many behaviour change, but we can't hang our hat on that. Yeah. And it's the same with adolescents, that we all need to be doing this work. I did some training. I think I did David Buick's training yesterday. Didn't you do that? It was very good. But he was saying the problem we've got is that we're sending them to maybe Kim's, so the Kim's are saying this is not an issue. Then they go to the DB service says, well, we don't deal with that. We don't deal with young men that are perpetrating. Yeah. And so there's nowhere, we're just bouncing them around. Yeah.
The other part of that is that even at 14, they're being labelled perpetrators.
Yeah.
And children of trauma.
Yeah.
That's the problem, isn't it? They're perpetrating towards control, but they're also survivors. Yeah. So how are we going to work with them where it's compassionate, empathy? And so with their story is not being heard, it's not, it's almost like they're not in their criminal justice space. It's not the whole story. So they're not going to engage in that because we're not hearing what it's about for them.
We often see in the sexual violence service, we see a combination, there's a correlation between all of the domestic violence, family violence, sibling violence, and we look at it from a behaviour perspective. So again, there's a trauma lensed approach. So I guess for us, there's a common crossover.
Yeah.
In violence.
Yeah. Yeah. And you'll see that come out of the NROS data. The other thing in child protection I always find is, and you would know that from the child protection space, is you've got mothers who also don't necessarily have an interest of the adolescent family violence becoming known in the child, because she's already tried to manage the adult perpetrator behavior to not be labeled and blamed for her unprotective behaviors. And now she's got another perpetrator in the home who might have impact on younger siblings, and another fear of children being removed because she's not managing everyone else's abusive behavior in the home. Yeah, and I guess the other thing only in that debate, I think there's at least some recognition, as there may be with the youth intervention space more broadly, that we recognize that young offenders, for want of a better word, are usually much more responsive to interventions and earlier interventions than by the time we're dealing with adult perpetrators of any kind of violence. But let's stick with the domestic and family violence space. So the NROS study came, I guess, primarily because the team that I've been working with, we saw this growing trend or conversation around young perpetrators, and 12, 14 years, and like, I mean, in the Victorian context, probably from 10 onwards, in terms of one in 10 of the family violence occurrence call-outs for police involving a young person between 10 and 19. And that would only be the tip of the iceberg, because we also know that it takes a long time for parents to call the police on their children. So that would be the very escalating end of any kind of adolescent use of violence in the home. But there seemed to be initially, at least, a very strong focus on perpetrator labels, accountability, likening them to adult perpetrators, being concerned that because they're young perpetrators that they're going to grow into adult perpetrators. But equally, I think from a youth service, youth law services in Victoria, and the child and youth family welfare services, having the concern that while there's this pathway into law and youth justice, that doesn't seem to be the answer. And I mean, I guess we know that for a lot of forms of violence, that the law alone isn't going to be the answer to addressing anything from let's say, from a deterrent point of view. I guess the other concerns were that in the Victorian context, for example, by young people, by having the possibility that a young person can be the respondent on a domestic violence protection order with parents as the aggrieved, we open up a whole new pathway into criminal justice or youth justice interventions, because as soon as that protection order is breached, we're talking about a criminal offence, and we're opening up a whole other pipeline into youth justice interventions. And I think the other thing, as we've just said, the concern that young people's experiences of trauma remain invisible in that whole conversation of law or legal responses and accountability mechanisms. I think the other thing, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, and I'd be keen to hear your practice experiences, particularly where you work with different family members. I think the other thing that is challenging about this space from a service provider perspective is that you've got different family members that have different kind of supports, trauma-informed and protective needs. Like at least, I guess, at the adult intimate partner violence level, nobody's responsible for anybody else. We know it's incredibly hard to leave and separate, and it's dangerous, and it comes with a whole lot of risks and insecurities, but at least nobody's being held accountable for the other person's housing scenarios or otherwise. Whereas when we're talking about children using violence against their parents and their dependent children, then parents have a responsibility and can't just say, well, I'm separating and, I'm moving out and you're moving out. So, there's a whole lot of other complexities that come into that relationship that sit alongside mothers, particularly mothers' recognition of trauma, of the history of violence that's often occurred in the home, the blame, the shame, the guilt that comes with mums already constantly being stigmatized for not adequately protecting children from adult intimate partner violence in the home. So you've got a whole lot of other, I guess, added layers of complications for families to seek help but then also for service providers to actually respond to the different family members, because you don't just have one adult victim survivor or one adult perpetrator that you're working with. So just in terms of the survey, we used a social marketing research company to get a half decent sample size. It's not representative of the overall population, so I'll get to that, particularly when talking about First Nations young people's experiences. They may not be representative in the survey, as much as we had 5% of young people who identified as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. There's other things to suggest that the sample is not necessarily representative. It's also not representative in terms of young people in remote regions. So the vast majority of survey participants were based in metropolitan and regional settings. We were particularly, I guess, predominantly interested in young people's self-reported use of violence and the intersection or overlap with their own childhood experiences, partly to really make that argument that when we look at or respond to young people using violence in the home, we cannot ignore the need to screen for underlying trauma and address underlying trauma where underlying trauma is present. So we looked at, witnessed. I want to acknowledge that these are experiences of violence, and we know that children are victims in their own right, and that intimate partner violence has a massive impact on children's development, even if they're never a direct target. But just to distinguish the two types of child abuse that we measured, one is exposure to or witnessing other family members' use of domestic and family violence, and the other one is being a direct target of physical, emotional, sexual, and other types of abuse. And then young people's self-reported use of violence in the home in terms of the types of violence they experienced and or used, and then also the types of perpetrators in terms of who they experienced violence by in the home growing up, but also who they used violence against as they started to use violence. And when I, like, obviously from the overview, when I say violence, I don't just mean physical violence. So I mean emotional, physical, psychological abuse, property damage, threats to harm, threats to kill, and so forth. Just in terms of a brief sample overview, so we had about 2/3 that identified as born females. We did ask them then about gender identity and so forth. But 2/3 female, 1/3 identified as male, assigned at birth. Of that total sample, 4% of young people identified as gender diverse or gender questioning, and almost 1/3 identified as a sexual orientation other than heterosexual. We had 5% young people that identified as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. 10% of young people came from a non-English speaking background, and 36% of the samples, so over 1/3, identified as living with a disability that included a broad range of cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities, so included ADHD, ASD, which will become relevant later on. So when we looked at gender, and this seems to be the biggest thing the media has picked up from this report, is that more girls than boys reported using violence in the home. And what if this means that girls are actually more violent than boys in the home? So I think the poor Emerald CEO had to do a whole lot of media commentary and damage control around the let's not use this in the wrong sense. So I think I think there's a few things that play into this. To start with, girls being more mindful and reflective of some of their behaviors, where we know from adult surveys that in adult student populations, for example, where people have tested over-reporting and under-reporting, that males are generally more likely to under-report use of abusive behavior, whereas women are more likely to over-report some of their behaviors in relationships as abusive behavior. So I think that, to start with, plays into this. I think the other thing that might play into this, we had more girls that reported use of violence towards siblings. So I think, again, it has something to do with mindfulness and understanding and identifying types of behaviours young people engaged in, and we had 2/3 of the sample being female. And more of them reported sibling violence, and sibling violence was the most common form of violence or abusive behaviours in the overall study. So I think those are some of the factors that have played into why we see some of the gender differences, and no massive or no significant differences in some of the more severe forms of violence. As you can see, the most common forms of violence people used, self-reported, were verbal, physical, emotional, psychological abuse, which is probably not surprising. You see the same in the personal safety survey and other adult kind of surveys. And those were the only categories where girls reported a slightly higher rate of having used violence in the past towards other family members, predominantly siblings. Whereas in the more serious categories of property damage, threats to harm, threats to kill, sexual violence, and so forth, there were no gender differences visible anymore. In terms of, and really, sorry if this looks super stats, it's really the key message to take away from this is around frequency. So we looked at young people that reported they used abusive behaviours towards other family members on at least a monthly basis for us to get a bit of a sense of what are some of the predictors of more serious forms of violence and more frequent forms of violence, as opposed to young people that might say, I did that, but less than on a monthly basis. And so you can see, again, probably no surprises really, that when you talk about verbal abuse, young people are almost equally as likely to say, or we had an almost even proportion that said that I did that quite frequently, at least on a monthly basis, compared to 52% who said I did that, but less than on a monthly basis. And then as you move into the more serious forms of violence, things become less frequent, or young people were less likely to say that that is something I engaged in on at least a monthly basis. Which, and I think if you think about adolescents in general, it's probably fairly easy for a lot of adolescents to say, I yelled at my parents, or I had a fight with siblings on at least a monthly basis, as opposed to some of the, actually using physical violence towards particularly parents or adults.
Sorry, I was just going to ask about sexual abuse.
So it's not the frequent, so this, I guess it's not the prevalence rate. It is for the young people who say, and the proportion was really small, less than 1% of young people said they engaged in sexual violence. Well, actually, maybe 2%.
Was there a gender difference in who was perpetrating that? Was there more males?
No. I mean, in numbers, yes, because we had more females in the sample, but yeah, in terms of percentage, no. So these are all less than 1%. Sexual violence, non-fatal strangulation. And so this is really just saying that of that very small proportion of young people that said I used sexual violence against a family member, they were then, so if you are a sexual violence offender in the family setting, you're, I guess, 1 in 3 would do that on a monthly basis at least, as opposed to 2 and 3 less. Does that make sense? So really it's just saying that in that particular category, you're then also more likely to find that a young person does it quite frequently compared to some of the other more, non-fatal strangulation, for example, which, I don't know, I'm not an expert in sexual offending, but it doesn't surprise me in the sense of that if you engage in sexual offending, I find it less surprising that that is something that might occur more frequently than the high end of actually trying to strangle someone, for example. In terms of who is at the receiving end, and I did mention at the beginning, so siblings by far, the vast majority of use of abusive behavior that young people reported was directed at siblings, followed by mothers, which is, I guess, maybe also not surprising. We'll look at some other stats in a second. Even where these are the people perpetrating the violence, young people were far less likely to say they were actually abusive, whether it was in retaliation or self-defense towards fathers or male carers, which I guess is not surprising because I think there's a whole lot of other issues there going on in terms of risk of harm, fear, intimidation, when dad is the one predominantly being abusive in the home as opposed to mum being abusive in the home. Low use of violence rate towards, step parents, grandparents, extended family. I think some of that is an opportunity thing. Obviously, siblings and parents are the most closest in terms of proximity, family conflict, and so forth. So you would expect them to be more likely to be at the receiving end of young people's use of violence than their grandparents or other extended family member, for example. I did mention, so no gender differences for anything. Girls and boys were no more likely or less likely to use violence against a mother, father, another carer, except for that girls said they were more likely, or that girls reported a higher prevalence rate of having used abusive behaviors towards their siblings. Okay. The use of violence, and I guess again, some or all of you may not be surprised of, I found this so depressing, and as I went through the report, putting the presentation together, and I looked at some of the quotes and some of the stats, like just so depressing. But in terms of the overall population that did not report any use of violence, so that's half the sample that had never used any adolescent family violence in the home. 22 experienced domestic and family violence, so that's 1 in 5 kids. So even in the ones that never go on to use anything, that's to me already a fairly high prevalence of growing up with domestic and family violence. That goes up to 43% when you look at the sample of young people that were, I guess, our particular focus in terms of using violence in the home. We've got almost 1 in 2 that have experienced domestic and family violence between other family members in isolation, and really small proportion of having experienced other forms of direct child abuse in isolation. Emma, I would be keen to actually hear the child protection side of things. What that obviously tells us is that direct child abuse is much more likely to happen hand in hand with domestic and family violence being in the home than domestic violence in the home necessarily always coming with child abuse. Yeah.
Can I just clarify? So 43% of teenagers that have used violence in the home experienced domestic and family violence.
Yes.
I find that quite low.
Sorry. In isolation, yes. So 97% of them did essentially have DV, because here's your cohort of over half that experienced both. And so, whereas over here, you've got about half of the sample that never used any violence that said, I grew up with DV, some level of DV. 28 of them also with child abuse directed at them, as opposed to 2% also with, sorry, now I've completely confused. So essentially you're adding these up here. So this is DV only, this is child abuse only, and this is your cohort that reported both. So if you wanted the total of experienced child abuse, it's 30%, because you've got 28 in here with also DV, and then 2% that's only child abuse. And if you wanted the total DV experience, you've got 50%, because you've got 28% that have DV and child abuse, and 22 that only have DV. And so, I guess maybe the interesting thing in it for both cohorts, whether they go on to use violence or not, is that child abuse in isolation seems to be very rare. DV in isolation a little more likely, but most commonly young people experience both, where one or the other is present. That's essentially just a different graph about it. It kind of gives you an indication of, if you look at the blue bars, that's your young people not using violence. The orange ones are the young people using violence. And essentially the likelihood of using violence increases as the different types of violence come together. Same with when we looked at greater frequency or being more likely to use violence more often and being more likely to use violence against more than one other family member. Again, I guess unsurprisingly, in the no childhood experiences is greater with the ones that infrequently or less often actually use violence in the home, whereas that proportion gets really small in the ones that say I use violence in the home quite frequently. And the same here in terms of young people, more likely to have no child abuse in the only one family member. And I guess, again, keep in mind, when it's only one family member, very often that's siblings. Whereas once young people started to use violence against other family members, they were also likely to use violence against siblings. So you already, like, I guess in homes where young people direct violence at mum, you can probably almost always assume, based on this data at least, that they're also using violence against at least younger siblings if there's younger siblings in the home. In terms of some of the other observations, and this is where I say some of the representation of young people may not be representative of the experiences of particularly, I think, First Nations young people in the broader population. But overall, for the 5% of young people in our sample, they were no more likely to report having used any violence against other family members at any given point in time. They were more likely to report in the sample that did use violence to then also more frequently use violence. Not necessarily more severe, but more frequent use of violence in the home. Young people with a disability were more likely to use any violence, frequent violence, and more severe forms of violence. And I'll get to some of that in a second. And I think in some ways it confirmed to us, there was a project also NROS funded, I think 3 years ago, the PIPA project in Victoria, that looked at young people's and families' experiences where adolescent family violence is identified and their contexts across different service systems. And parents certainly reported greater levels of ADHD, ASD, and so forth, and concerns that they're being labeled and misidentified, and that the underlying trauma isn't recognized, and instead the responses at it's a disability or it's something we can medicate. They come in contact with child and youth mental health services or youth justice services, for example, rather than looking at the intersection of why we see these greater levels of disability in relation to childhood experiences.
Schools to do that labeling as well.
Yeah.
That the parents may not have already might not considered, but there's what I hear from a lot of parents, which from schools are able to get their funding to support those children.
Sometimes it's both.
Yeah.
You know, that you.
Well, and I guess that is the danger. But if it's so I think one of the concerns in the Victoria landscape context was that the responses are very symptomatic. So it is, it's the labeling, and then there's a symptomatic response to what do we do, and whether that is medication, whether that's additional support, whether that's special schooling pathways, or whatever it might be, as opposed to going, hang on, if there's adolescent use of violence and there's these other disabilities identified, should trigger all the warning bells to go, are there other things going on in the home? And I think one of the challenges there, not just for the children with disability, but more broadly, is the invisibility of that other violence in the home. sometimes even when it's ongoing, because the focus is on the young person's problem behavior and labeling and addressing that problem behavior and responding to symptoms. But what we found in the initial consultation was that even more so the invisibility, because service providers didn't seem to recognize that if there was violence in the intimate partner level violence, the assumption that because parents have separated and the perpetrator is no longer in the home, the perpetrator's behavior also no longer has an impact on the young person's behavior. When we know, like we know from the IPV research that, intimate partner violence doesn't end just because people separate, and even less so when there's children involved and some level of ongoing contact.
A lot of where to refer then anyway. So
Yes.
even if it is
Yeah.
identified, like
Yeah.
I guess if I'm looking at notes and stuff, and I can see from the child development services, they've identified going, yes, these are some of, we don't want to label this person because we actually do think that's the underlying trauma
Yeah.
that's kind of impacted this, but also going, well, what do we do with that now? Like, where do we refer?
Yes.
Where the
Yeah.
services that can do that work?
Yeah.
Because I guess it's family system work as well, and that's something
Yeah.
that's when it's linked to child safety in that sense of
Yeah.
going, it's not the most appropriate in this sense, but also what do we do with it? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess some of that goes back to what you already said earlier, Emma, about we don't even know in the adult perpetrator space, and we've been doing that work for much longer than we've focused on identifying young people's use of violence and their relevant support needs. And as you say, very often, like the research shows that across a variety of practice areas, particularly in health services, that people say, if I don't know where to refer, then I might as well better not ask, because once I start asking and screening and identifying, I need to do something with it. And what if there's nowhere to then send people?
Easy to go down that diagnostic kind of route to go, we can actually, I mean, which
Because
is our system anyway, like we
Yeah.
apologise
Yeah.
to people, but
Yeah.
that's kind of, that seems to be we can at least feel like we've achieved something with medication or something. We're going the other way,
Yeah.
we don't have options for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I'll unpack these a little bit, because there were some differences when we just looked at the young people who identified in certain ways, whether that's cultural wise or whether that's sexual identity wise, between young people who didn't identify in that category. But once we controlled for other factors, particularly disability, none of these remain significant in terms of non-English speaking background status, and young people identifying with gender diverse and or diverse sexual orientation. So one of the things, and I guess that it's also not surprising, given that all this data shows that the experiences of childhood trauma predict the use of violence during adolescence. Young people who are identified as living with a disability were more likely, so they are the orange ones, more likely to say, I've used any form of violence, I've used severe forms of violence in the home, and I've used frequent use of violence. They were also over twice as likely to actually having experienced childhood abuse in the combination of either parental DV or carer DV and or targeted abuse. So, I guess no surprises there once we actually start looking at young people's exposure across those different priority cohorts, that the ones that have higher levels of childhood exposure to DV and other forms of child maltreatment are then also, once you separate them out into different kind of cohorts, the ones that are more likely to use violence in the home, which I think, again, has implications for what we just said in terms of when you respond to young people maybe identifying with a disability, recognizing or having that awareness that they're also more likely to have experienced other forms of child abuse and underlying trauma. Same with the gender diversity of young people, although, as I said, that went away once we controlled for disability. For example, it didn't matter anymore whether young people identified as cisgender, male or female, or gender diverse. But just in the group comparison between the cisgender identified young people and the gender diverse young people were more likely to report any use of violence, frequent use of violence, and more severe use of violence. And again, they were also almost twice as likely as young people who identified as cisgender young people to have experienced child abuse and domestic violence. Very often, and that's probably going to come up more out of the second report where we looked at help seeking and support needs, very often very targeted at their gender identity or their sexual orientation, particularly in terms of the psychological and emotional abuse that young people experience in the home. And then same for sexual orientation. So again, the orange ones are the ones that identified as anything other than heterosexual. And they were more likely to use any forms of violence, frequent forms of violence, severe forms of violence. But again, similar to the other two cohorts we've just spoken about, they were also more likely to report experiences of domestic and family violence and targeted forms of child abuse. My fault. I'll finish up with I guess, how young people make sense and some of the impacts they reported, because those are the qualitative responses they shared with us. And I think what becomes fairly obvious, if it doesn't already become obvious from the statistical data, is that young people essentially said, I seem to repeat what was done to me, even though I know it's not okay to do so. So there was a lot of qualitative feedback where young people explicitly linked what they witnessed, what they experienced, what was directed at them, and how they then used that either in disciplining younger siblings or in retaliating or defending themselves towards adult carers or parents. So this was probably the most, like, we had so many open-ended responses. The reactive and retaliatory violence, where people say, I use it as a defense mechanism. You do this to me, I do this to you. Essentially, and many of them recognized as this young male sat down here, it's a terrible sight. People say, one family member does it, I do it in retaliation or to defend myself. There's more violence and disciplining and threats being done then at the adult level, and it becomes a vicious cycle. In terms of these, I briefly touched on that earlier, just in terms of the patterns of retaliatory violence against the different family members. So these are where young people reported they had also been the victim of abusive behaviors by a sibling, by a mother, by a father, by a step-parent, grandparents, and extended family. So I guess this kind of reflects what we saw earlier anyway. Young people were less likely to use violence against other carers, extended family members, and grandparents. But here is, given that we didn't have those, we have those statistics, they're not in here, but given that siblings and fathers were the most common perpetrators of violence against young children, it's interesting that it is still siblings and mothers that are the ones most likely at the receiving end. I guess, as I said earlier, not surprisingly, because I think there is a lot more fear and intimidation experienced by young people experiencing violence by a father or male carer as opposed to a mother or female carer. But it is quite interesting that the reflection is, while fathers are more likely to be the perpetrators, mothers are more likely to be at the receiving end when young people use violence in the home then. In terms of the nature of sibling violence, and I think we'll do more analysis just in terms of some of the frequency and severity, because I think some of the qualitative feedback that we got suggests that there's a broad spectrum of sibling violence in that sample, with some people saying, really anybody who has a sibling fights at times, and sometimes that gets verbally or physically abusive, and that's just sibling behavior. But others very clearly saying that they've been abused by siblings and that it is a learned behavior. and that they lose their ability to, respond in a healthier or more proactive way of resolving any kind of conflict. In terms of the intergenerational use of violence, it goes much more back to the initial quote that I had in terms of, I saw this, I experienced this, I learned this, and then I did it myself, and very often it becomes a vicious cycle. And I think here very much a lot of these quotes, whether it's female participants or male participants, referring to their father as the main source of stress, violence, abusive behavior, threats in the household, and saying, that I try to use, essentially resolve any kind of conflict using the same kind of tactics that my parents, carers, or whoever subjected me to violence used. A lot of recognition around becoming like their father, knowing they never wanted to, and growing up with that trauma, and then essentially recognizing that they're starting to display the very same patterns they were always afraid of, and they had sworn never to use themselves. And then I think, this one, I guess, is, similar, but also really showing that kind of sense in young people of saying, essentially, I had to show that you can no longer abuse me like that, and that I will no longer take the abusive behaviors, even though that many of the quotes reflected that young people often knew it often escalated into further violence and subjected them to further violence, but young people trying to take a stand and saying, I've caught this for so long, I need to stand up for myself and send a message and say, you cannot do this is not okay. And, again, depending on what sector or practice area you work in, a lot of this will be unsurprising and probably things that you see on a daily basis. Social and emotional impacts. And again, with some of them, I wondered whether we see a gendered impact, because we had by far more female open-ended responses on the various impacts that young people experience than male responses. It is possible that that is a gender phenomenon of survey responses of girls having taken more time to actually provide qualitative responses rather than saying, okay, I'll do what I can tick off in a box, but I'm not necessarily going to write half an essay here to explain to you what my experience and my expectations and my support needs are. But anything from suicidality, depression, anxiety, guilt, shame of repeating the same kind of cycle of violence in the home, social isolation. Quite a few young people spoke about saying it made it incredibly hard for them to make friends, maintain friends. They had a lack of trust in other people. As soon as other people raise their voice, they get physical reactions and they feel anxious. And so a lot of, I guess, self-inflicted social isolation of young people trying to just avoid anything that might trigger them in the context of interpersonal relationships. Physical impacts, probably also not surprising, like young people talked about, that they have to cover their injuries that their parents or siblings inflict on them. Quite a few of them spoke about parents keeping them home from school because parents would have inflicted harm, but then didn't want anybody to know about it, which I'll get to the educational impacts in a second. But, I think to some extent, child abuse wise, not much different to what we see in adult survivors reporting, the long lasting scars and constant reminders of the experiences of trauma. Young people, particularly those that identified as culturally and linguistically diverse, more so than necessarily in the First Nations context, although I find this quite interesting because I guess it has implications more broadly when we talk about cultural connectedness as a protective factor for young people in general, for emotional well-being. But young people disconnecting from culture, religion, cultural identity because they associated their parents' use of violence with a culture or a cultural belief, cultural approval of physical violence in the home, for example, which, I guess it's problematic and sad in terms of what we know about the role of cultural identity as a protective factor for so many areas of young people's and growing into adulthood well-being.
And so when you see
Yeah.
intersection in regards to people's sexuality and what they obviously been reading it, vicarious and pansexual, in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's saying, I don't identify with that
Yeah.
heterosexual relationship.
Yeah.
And because to me, that brings violence. So
Yeah.
that's an interesting sort of, correlation with,
Yeah.
what we're
Yeah.
seeing.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
identifying as.
Yes, yes. And I think it's interesting because, and I'm glad we asked the questions about sexual identity, because we had an advisory board for it, and we had some of the queer youth services involved on making sure we capture sexual orientation and identity. Because, like, particularly when you look at the 30-odd% that identified as something other than heterosexual, young people are much more likely to identify as something other than cisgender and as something other because they're more comfortable, and the next generation is more likely to articulate those things, which then, when it comes to intersection of family violence targeted at that kind of lack of acceptance in the family home, or that lack of tolerance in the family home, of that kind of diversity. I guess as much as it's empowering for young people, it creates other stresses when there's no acceptance, particularly in the family environment.
It's almost like an active resistance.
Yes.
Yeah. Oppression. Yeah.
And then the last couple of things are the impact on, I want to say, the impact on education. And I guess there were two separate things that came out of the qualitative comments of young people. So one was that, people didn't go to school for one reason or another, very often because they were injured, and either they themselves didn't want other people to see or know, or parents made sure they didn't go because parents didn't want school to know. So the impact of just, I guess, missed education because of growing up with violence in the home, but then equally the impact on school performance. And, I guess none of that is surprising. We know some of that's coming out of the adult survivor, workforce participation, and the impact on ability to focus, ability to participate, ability to actually be present and absorb whatever kind of content or material it is. But, young people reflecting on how hard it was for them, even when they went to school, to focus, to learn, to retain information, to engage with that. And I guess at the extreme end, the mental health issues and the impacts that just led to a complete inability to function. Whether that was in a schooling environment or somewhere else, but if school then, and this comes out of the second report, education, I think, played quite a big role for young people, where they had hope for support and just didn't get it.
Yeah, I know a 16-year-old that's in a PIA relationship, and because of that, she has Philippines before, and they're wanting to suspend a total, exit her out of the school system, and that's the onus eyes on her.
Yeah.
There's just no understanding around safe space.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think we've seen the same in some of the Queensland death reviews of young people's suicide, and that exclusion, growing up with child abuse and parental, domestic and family violence, the impact on their ability to attend school as a safe space, but because they also come with behavioral issues and other problems. School only gives them so many opportunities because there is no trauma-informed approach, and then all eyes are gone. So I guess just in summary, 1 in 2 young people that reported experiencing child abuse in our sample also reported they went on to using violence themselves. So I guess that in and of itself, we could say, well, I guess there's a 50-50 chance that children turn out okay. I think what my takeaway message is that when you look at the population that uses violence in the home, more than 9 and 10, between 89 and 96%, depending on whether you're looking at the frequent use or infrequent use of violence. The vast majority has childhood trauma, meaning childhood trauma is an opportunity for an early intervention. Yeah.
Just going back to where you said 50-50 and,
Yeah.
50% use it. Was there any information about the ones that aren't using it being victims in DV relationships? So not actually perpetrating violence, but susceptible to being in those relationships where they're not.
Adult dating, in adolescent dating relationships.
Yeah.
We did not look at that.
Yeah. Because we see that a lot, I guess, in our history as well.
Yeah.
Where there's a percentage of perpetrators, but then you've got the other half that become the victims in the relationship as well.
Yeah. And we had those conversations with the advisory board initially, but we also tried to keep the survey to a 15-minute length, because the advice from the survey company was that, particularly with young people, as soon as it gets too long, you're losing your response rate. We do have another funding application under review that would look at in a national sample at adolescent dating violence, and then one of the, I guess, other areas is whether they've also experienced and or used.
As I see a correlation when I go back to history, a lot of our perpetrators have been exposed to DV, and a lot of our victims have been exposed to DV and or sexual abuse as well.
Yeah.
So there's that correlation there of the trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, as I said earlier, young people were far less likely to experience direct abuse in isolation. DV in isolation was a bit more, I guess, more common. But for the majority that had experienced child abuse, combining those two together, had experienced both forms. So suggesting, particularly in the child abuse or, the direct child maltreatment category, that for this cohort, at least, where child abuse was present, it was highly likely that parental or carer DV was also present, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case for. So, I guess in a service system contact, if you have contact with a family where there's no parental domestic violence, you can't necessarily assume that there's also child abuse going on. But based on this data, when you come across child abuse, you can almost always assume that there's also some form of parental or other family members, domestic and family violence going on. And then in terms of the types of abuse, like as we looked at the having experienced both in combination, increases the risk of any use of violence, severe use of violence, more frequent use of violence. And if you compare the young people that reported direct child abuse and growing up with parental DV, they were 9 times more likely than young people who reported no child abuse to actually use violence in the home. So, again, going back in the initial one, we may say the odds are 50-50 that somebody is going on, but once you have a combination of these risk factors, really it highlights the opportunities and the need for early intervention and trauma-informed responses to children in families where there's child abuse and or domestic and family violence going on. We looked at some of the differences in terms of who's at the receiving end. As I said, siblings were most likely in this study, followed by mothers. And as we've seen both from the quantitative data and the qualitative feedback that young people provided, young people very closely linked their use of violence to their experiences of violence in the home, whether that was in immediate self-defense, whether that was in long-term retaliation, or whether that was just recognized in a form of social learning where young people realized at some stage they had started to adopt exactly the kind of behaviors they grew up with, they grew up being scared of, and they swore never to engage in. And we've just looked at all the different, I guess, adverse social outcomes, emotional outcomes, cultural and educational outcomes that young people described experiencing. just in terms of what this means, and I want to say I probably have more questions than answers, but some of the things that stand out for me, and I'd be keen to have a bit of a discussion of what this means for you, or what you kind of see in your practice, or what kind of questions come up for you in your practice. I guess, I mean, one of the things that it probably highlights very strongly is the room, the need, and the opportunities around early interventions. Partly in the educational space, because young people reported quite a bit of engagement challenges and help seeking in the educational space. And I guess more broadly in the child and family welfare space, whether that's statutory or non-statutory. I think the other thing is child-centered recovery. And I guess to some extent, we don't want to forget that, particularly where there's domestic and family violence, we have a child and we have an adult victim. So I think part of that really is to emphasize some of the models that we see coming out of mother-child focused kind of recovery interventions. But I think it also really highlights that as much as we keep saying we're recognizing children as victims in their own right, we still forget about their recovery support. Like we disrupt and interrupt, and we intervene in a crisis, and we establish immediate safety. And then somehow we just assume that everybody goes on to be okay, when we know, from all the life course research more broadly, that having those kind of adverse childhood experiences are a high-risk indicator for, school disengagement, contact with the youth justice system, adult contact with the criminal justice system, poor mental health outcomes, drug and alcohol use, and so forth. I guess, and somebody mentioned that earlier, in terms of the holistic family, I think you said it's whole of family work, really, whether it's one service provider or whether it's a service system. I guess what makes it tricky, but what also creates opportunities, is that you have points of interventions with different family members, whether that's identified by an adult survivor or an adult perpetrator who comes to the attention of different kind of support or intervention services, or at the child protection end, or I guess the child welfare end, whether it's statutory or non-statutory. But the opportunities to have trauma-informed responses that really recognize the different levels of trauma that everybody may be dealing with in the family home, keeping those visible and supporting the different kind of family members. I think, particularly, Emma, what you were saying about the child protection space earlier, that otherwise I think we always risk that there's a focus on trauma-informed on younger siblings being exposed to adolescent family violence, for example, in the child protection space, while we forget about that young person using violence and their own trauma and recovery needs, and mothers who are expected to manage all of that, but really very often also have their own unaddressed trauma recovery needs from their own experiences of intimate partner violence. And then I guess some of the findings around the different or diverse cohorts, and I really love what you said earlier about the resistance, but also really the opportunities to identify, particularly in the youth space, when you work with or come across young people that identify as gender diverse or identify as anything other than heterosexual, and may report or families may report use of violence in the home, and that big overlap with experiences of childhood trauma, and again, very often unaddressed childhood trauma, very often specifically targeted at that identity. And, I guess all the recovery implications and empowerment implications and family support implications that raises, and then particularly in the disability space, just because it was one of those variables that no matter what else was going on, no matter what someone identified as culturally or sexual identity wise, once they reported having a disability, they were more likely to use any and all kinds of adolescent family violence, and were also more likely to have experienced different forms of child abuse. And then the last one we already covered in terms of the holistic responses and whole of family responses. And that's it. Thank you very much.
the things coming up and presenting that massive report.
Very happy for you to PDF that and share it.
Yeah. I will stop the recording, but, yeah, thanks so much for